Hey everybody, welcome to episode 58 of the USMB Lead Pods and episode 2 of the video version of the Lead Pods. Thank you for checking us out, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. Thanks for checking out the video. And of course, if you prefer the audio, you can also listen to the audio podcast on Apple, Google, or Spotify, hopefully wherever you get your podcasts. Today I'm joined by a new friend of mine, Jason Moore. He wrote a book called Both and it's specifically talking about the future of hybrid church. So post-COVID, how can we do in-person and online services well, and how can those worlds meet? And regardless of what your church is currently doing online, how big or small your church might be, he's got some really great things I think you're going to enjoy. This is one of my favorite conversations we've had in a while. I've been looking forward to sharing this with you. So I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jason Moore. All right, my friends. Well, I have a new friend I'm excited to introduce you to. Today, I'm speaking to Jason Moore. He is the owner of Mennonite Productions. He has written not 11, but 12 books, including the one that we're going to talk about today. I'm really excited to introduce it to you. If you haven't heard about it yet, Both and. It's a great book that I'm reading right now. I actually got to meet Jason just a few weeks ago. We were both in Atlanta for a conference. We went to that church conference. Jason was the first speaker. He kicked things off really, really well, and it was one of my favorite sessions. So afterwards, I chased him down and was like, Jason, I'm part of this church with a bunch of crazy Mennonites. We would love to get to know you. And he graciously agreed to be on with the podcast today. So Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Matt, I am thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with you, and it was great to meet you in Atlanta, and fun to meet up virtually, after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been friends on Facebook, and Jason, you wrote this book, Both and we'll get to that here in just a minute. It's got a pretty kind of an interesting origin story, but it just keeps climbing up the Amazon charts. I think you said number 6 yesterday. You're getting more, just a ton of, you're staying busy with webinars and meetings and coaching. So congrats on the success of the book, and it's just blowing up. It's great to see.
Well, thank you. I'm in awe of what God has done through it. I have, when I was putting the whole thing together that started off as training, I called it manna from heaven. I mean, God just handed it to me. I collected it off the beach and just to see what God's done with it. Yeah, actually, I think yesterday was number 7.
Okay.
It has been all the way, when it first released, it spent almost a whole week at number 1 and 2, and it's been in the top 10 a lot, and in the top 100 since it came out in February 14th. And I can't even process the fact that when I go to look, it's sometimes still in the top 10, which is unbelievable.
Oh, that's awesome. We'll get to your book here in just a second, but before we get to that, any other bio stuff you want to share? So I know you do a lot of kind of coaching with churches. For people who don't know you yet, what is kind of your short bio? How do you work with churches?
Sure. Well, I got my start in ministry as a media producer. So I was on staff at a large United Methodist church. That was one of the flagship churches in the denomination back at the time. And we were a little over 3,000 attendants when I was on staff there. I went to art school. I'm a motion graphics guy, graphic artist, that kind of thing. So when I was on staff at this church, my role was really to help with worship design, and we would do kind of a collaborative process from the ground up. And that's sort of where I got to be known a bit as a speaker, and publishers started talking to us about publishing and all those kind of things. So I started writing when I was on staff at that church. I felt a strong call to help small and medium-sized churches learn how to do more with creativity and with media. I've been at this long enough that I was on the early end of trying to help churches just install screens in their sanctuaries. Like that was my shtick for a long time, was how do we create media inclusive worship, where we're including graphics and video and all those kind of things. And so for 20 something years, I got my start in 97 as an intern while I was in art school at this church, and then went full time after that. And so I also have started a couple of media resource houses. So I started a company in Dallas years back in 2000. We created graphics and videos and all that kind of stuff for churches that use the Revised Common Lectionary, for those who are familiar with that.
Okay.
And then a couple of years after that, I started my current company, Mennonite Productions, with another guy, and he has since moved on. But I'm really passionate about helping people create worship that lasts beyond Sunday. Deep meaningful creative worship, not worship
Mm.
where creativity is the driver, but there's deep, theological connection and that is discipleship based. I see worship as the front door
Mm.
into discipleship and the missional action. We've got to inspire people into those things. And things were trucking along pretty well. I was doing 30 to 40 speaking engagements a year. And then COVID showed up.
Right, right.
And in the course of a week, I had 6 events canceled that I was supposed to go speak at in person.
Mm.
Um, Sadly, I have spoken in 47 of our 50 states, and in 2020, I had the other 3 scheduled. I was supposed to
Oh
go to
man.
Alaska. Alaska, Maine, and Rhode Island are my last 3 states, and I had already booked the flights for Maine and Rhode Island and Alaska. They told me to book it, and I was like, I don't know, this COVID thing seems like it could be a problem, and they're like, well,
Yeah.
go ahead and book it, and I held off, and then I think the next week they're like, yeah, probably shouldn't book that, and thankfully I hadn't, but um, so I have
Bummer.
I have online spoken in those states, but I haven't been to those physical places yet.
Well, online
Um,
counts, right? Like we're about to talk about. Online counts.
there
So
you go. There you go. Yeah. Technically, I'm a worldwide guy now.
there you go.
But anyway, I found myself in a position where people were looking for guidance, and while I have been involved with ministry online and things in the past, it was not really um, my primary focus.
Hmm.
Worship and worship design and all of those sorts of things were the things that I've been talking about for 20 something years. And when the pandemic hit, I had a church reach out to me and say, um, I had done an in-person visit with them in 2019, I believe it was, in Denver, and they were like, "Hey, when the pandemic shut us all down, they said we
Hmm.
can't use any of the stuff you taught us when you came out and did our secret worshiper consultation. Will you watch our service online and tell us what to do?"
Yeah.
And so I did that, and that was like the first week of the pandemic. Wrote an article, posted based on that. I said to the pastor, I said, "Would you mind if I like shared some of these things with others because I think everybody just jumped online."
Yep.
And he was like, "No, go for it." And did put that out, and like it went viral. And I started
Hmm.
getting invitations like that week to start leading trainings for hybrid or minute. At that point, it wasn't even hybrid; it was just all online.
Right.
And then that morphed into hybrid stuff. And I've now led those 2 trainings. The first one I did was called "Telling the Old Story in a New Time," and it
Mm.
was really about. I used the metaphor of taking a book and making it a film
Yep.
as the way to frame the conversation because you
Hmm.
can't just put a camera in the back of the room
Right.
and go about business as usual. We got to reimagine the way we experience worship and so on. And
Yep.
then that in the fall of 20, I put together this other training called Both and Maximizing Hybrid Worship for In-Person and Online Experiences. And the whole idea was that um, when we get people back in the room, if we're not careful, we've woken them up to what it feels like to be talked to directly because we looked at the
Yep.
camera and we
Hmm.
developed worship for them. And I think the temptation is we get people back in the room and we just go back to talking to the people in the room, and people at home are now observers of what's
Yep.
happening in the room, not
Hmm.
participants. And so developed that. I've
Yeah.
done that one about, I don't know, 90 times or something. I'm doing it again this evening for a group. And then the other one I think I've done like 40 or 50 times, something like that. So
Yeah.
it's been a crazy couple of years in multiple ways, but in my world, it really sent me into the world of webinars. And thankfully, things are calming down enough that I get to go meet people like you in person.
Yeah.
So glad about that.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously such an important topic, and it's one of those things where the church probably needed to be doing all these things anyway, right? Back in 2019, we probably should have been doing a lot of this, but a lot of us, whether it was intentional, we didn't think it mattered, or just staff or whatever, we weren't really doing online at all. Or if we were, like you talked about, we probably maybe just had one webcam at the back of the room or whatever. But one of the big points that you make is, like you just said, that 2020 woke us up and now people are used to being online. And if we just go back to what we did before, or if we, even worse, heaven forbid, if we shut down our online, we're kind of just ruining a lot of the equity that we built and just kind of not taking advantage of opportunities, right? So walk us through that. If people, let's start with this. If people are still struggling with quote unquote counting online, if they feel like church online doesn't really count as church. That's an argument I
Yeah.
hear a lot. I'm sure there's something that you hear a lot. How do you talk to people about that?
Well, I certainly can understand the criticism or the misunderstanding. I think some
Hmm.
people have never experienced truly transcendent worship online
Yeah.
because all they've ever experienced is the camera in the back of the room.
Right.
But I have seen people who have really reimagined worship from the ground up, where we include people at
Hmm.
home as full participants through chat, through the way we look at the camera, through asking reflection questions that people both in the room and online can respond to. I would say for the critics, I mean, let's just consider that our educational system these days makes use of online. I mean, people get degrees
Yeah.
who never step foot into a classroom, right? They do
Hmm.
their online education, and if it's good enough for academia, I would think it's probably good enough for us, and even beyond good enough. I really think that we can create transcendent worship. But for me, and one of the things I talk about in the book, and this is pretty foundational, and I think for some folks it helps them have an aha moment, and that is that Paul's ministry was hybrid ministry.
Right.
The foundation of the church began in a hybrid approach. So
Hmm.
all throughout Acts, Paul is preaching to the people in person. He's physically gathered with them.
Yep.
And then, of course, he finds himself in prison and, and in other ways begins writing these epistles. And he is literally leading the church through hybrid means, through socially distanced methods.
Right.
And he's preaching to them too. He's not leading worship, but it's preaching and it's
Hmm.
leadership through those means. And Paul wanted to be in person too. Like if you read
Yeah.
his writings, he
Hmm.
regularly says, "I long to be with you. I wish we were
Right.
together right
Hmm.
now."
Hmm.
And so really, if we will embrace this moment rather than run from it, I think that we're in a sense bookending um,
Yeah.
the life of the church. That
Hmm.
today we are finally kind of back to where we started in some ways with this idea that worship and ministry and the gospel can live both in physical space and not in Paul's time it wasn't digital space, but I think it
Right.
can live in digital space as well today. So um, I also think we just have to recognize that like there's so many disruptions that happen as a result of COVID,
Hmm.
and the church is got to live in that world too. So think about like what's happened with meal delivery service. I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of us now we call DoorDash and they show up at our door, or we. I mean, pre-pandemic, you could order food ahead of time, but now most of us will order and go pick up.
Hmm.
Think about what happened in the movie industry for a bit. They started releasing films both in our homes on streaming on the day they'd be in the theater, and for a long time the theaters were closed. And of course, like I said, education. So,
Hmm.
um, I think we've just got to embrace the moment, and we can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend like the world hasn't changed because
Right.
it has. And if we don't do the work of reimagining ministry for now, then I think we will lose something in the process.
Yeah.
I guess one final thought, and
Sure.
I write about this in the book too. The large church that I was on staff at, called Ginghamsburg United Methodist Church, the pastor there, my friend, my mentor, really the guy that is responsible in some ways for my ministry, Mike Slaughter, used to often say, if you put it up for a vote, the people always vote to go back to Egypt.
That's right.
um, and some of us, I think, we want to revert back to 2019. We want to go
Hmm.
back to the captivity of the past rather than step into the promised land of this new reality.
Hmm.
And I get it.
Yeah.
Your first day in the promised land feels very uncomfortable because you don't know
Yeah.
your way around. You don't know all the stuff. You knew captivity well. We lived in that world for a very long time. So,
Hmm.
what does it look like for us to embrace this moment and walk boldly into it, even as we're trying to figure it out, from scratch,
Yeah.
because there's a wonderful opportunity here.
Yeah. And I think it is funny whenever I hear these kinds of conversations, I've heard people say we never have trouble, quote unquote, counting the online giving, right? Those gifts count. we're not just counting the in-person giving, we're counting all the giving, right? So if you're going to count the online
Yes.
giving, you need to count the online attendance also, right? So
Yes.
one thing that I've heard you talk a lot about, which I want to dive into a little bit, is I think one way that churches can, it's a kind of an easy tweak to kind of improve the online experience, is to kind of bring the in-person and online together, right? So one thing I think you said at the conference was that you recommend that people have a whiteboard in the tech booth, right? And write down the number of how many people are watching online. So there's an actual number that the pastor, the leader, whoever can see, okay, there's 57 people that are on the other end of this camera right now. And that kind of helps the eye contact and those kinds of things. Another
Yeah.
story, I wonder if you can tell us this story. I think it was at the conference you mentioned, I think you called it the Amen Room. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you share that story with us?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a church in Columbia, South Carolina that I just love. They're one of my favorite churches to talk about when I'm teaching. I've gotten to go visit them twice. They brought me in to do some training and some consultation work and things. Pastor George Ashford is the pastor there. This is a large African American church, or at least large in my tribe. They were pre-pandemic about 600 weekly in attendance,
Okay.
and Pastor George said, "I've got a lot of people that don't want to get vaccinated, but they still want to be a part of our church." And so they f- basically had to figure out, how are we going to create the same sort of experience for people that they had in the room. In the African American tradition, call and response is an important part of the worship experience. So
Right.
pastor preaches, the people are very active in shouting things out, and there's a dialogue really that kind of happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have in their church what they call the Amen section.
Okay.
It's three high top tables that they have servants that sit at. They have little cards on the front of the table that say social media ambassador.
Okay.
And so they do a few things. So many great takeaways from what they do. First is that they have folks in the chat, that every single person that comes into the chat gets a welcome by name. They really kind of prime the pump for people participating in the chat by saying, if you're new with us today, we consider you a guest. Put G in if you're a guest. If you're a member,
Mm-hmm.
put M in. If you're a frequent flyer, put FF. And actually they do that in the reverse order. So M's and FFs go first, so that when the G's put their names in, all the frequent flyers and guests welcome those
Oh,
folks.
that's
So
smart.
they get a wonderful greeting. And then they really chat with them all throughout the experience. Second thing is, they do exactly what you were talking about a moment ago. They have this whiteboard that they write the number on. It's a really big whiteboard, so they would write the number of people worshiping in real time,
Mm-hmm.
not just for the sake of recording it or anything like that. It allows the room to be aware of how many people are worshiping online. And when I was there, it started with the 25, and they raced it and it became 50, and then 80, and then 100, went all the way up into the 130s. And we've got to remember, that's 130 households, not 130 people.
Right.
And of course, you don't know how long they're on, but
Sure.
it meant that the people in the room could feel the presence and have an awareness of those who were not in the room. And of course, it
Mm-hmm.
helped Pastor George as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing, the reason they call it the Amen section, this was my favorite, is that people would put comments in the chat like, "Preach it, Brother Ashford," and someone actually from the Amen section might yell out, "Preach it, Brother Ashford," and they would yell out the comments. And so they actually
Yeah.
gave voice to the people not in the room, again, making them full participants. And what I always suggest to folks, and when I tell these stories, is that it doesn't just mean something to the person at home that heard their comment shouted out.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
means something to the people in the room who get to feel the presence of those who are not with them.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
I think I showed the clip when I was with you,
Mm-hmm.
of a moment that I saw when I was with them back in August last year. Pastor George says, he talks to Sister Sarah. "When you came in this morning," he
Uh-huh.
says, "you talked about how the devil was riding your back, and your hip is hurting and your back is hurting." Well, he's not talking about physically in the building. He's talking about when you came into the chat this morning, you were talking
Yeah.
about that. And so he does this little moment where he's kind of preaching to her and um, giving her some encouragement. But of course, the room is in on this too, and they're hearing this kind of healing message that is
Mm-hmm.
being offered to her. And George takes the moment to say, I'm talking to somebody online right now. And he's looking right at the camera. And of course, he's talking to the room as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a powerful moment. And again, I think it meant something to Sarah, but I
Mm-hmm.
think about all those people in that room who know Sarah, who can
Yeah.
picture Sarah, who know that Sarah on that day maybe didn't feel good enough to come in because her back is hurting or whatever,
Yeah.
but she's still a full participant in the experience of worship. So I
Yeah.
think we've got to be really careful about ranking people in terms
Mm-hmm.
of their importance to our church by where they sit. You're
Yep.
not more important if you sit in the front of the room than if you sit in the back. You're not more
Mm-hmm.
important if you sit on the floor level than if you sit in the balcony.
Right.
And you're not more important if you're in the building than if you're at home. And if you're at home one week and you're in the building the next week, and then you're at home the next week, or you're on vacation or whatever, your value doesn't go up and down based on where you're sitting.
Right.
uh,
Right.
they're all important. So I remind
Yeah.
folks all the time, people at home are real people that
Absolutely.
really
Yep.
need Jesus, that
Mm-hmm.
really want to worship, you
Yep.
know?
And I love that too, because I think when you're in the room, just because you're there and you're present and you're focused on what's going on, you just it's not on your mind that there's also this other audience that are with you, but they're just not in the same room. And so I think it's like you said, it's just helpful for the people in the room also to remember there's a larger expression going on, and it's helpful both ways, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, and the other thing I would say is just remember that the people in the room do not have access to your analytics reports.
right,
They
right,
don't know, they don't even know how to track what's happening. So your eyes only tell a part of the story when you're in the room. And I think some of our churches are suffering a bit from low morale because they look around and they say, where'd all of our people go? Our church
right.
is falling apart. But then
Yep.
you look at the numbers online or even the giving.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the ideas that I share in the book is to bring back the concept of the hymn board. The old
Yeah.
hymn boards that used to say hymn number and last week's
Yep.
attendance and last week's offering. We ought to be telling those stories. So last week's attendance is not what we saw in the room last Sunday. It is
Yep.
Sunday in the room, and then Sunday to next Saturday, or whatever we're seeing online. We ought to actually tell people what those numbers were. So I encourage pastors and leaders to put on their screen maybe sort of the digital equivalent of
Mm-hmm.
the hymn board. Bring
Yeah.
bring that up and tell those numbers.
Yeah, that's good. I like that a lot. There's so many things that, yeah, we just kind of forget about in the moment. You've talked a lot about the chat online. I want to go back to that just a little bit. Our church found during the pandemic, but even now, so Ridgepoint in Wichita streams to YouTube, Facebook, and to church online. And it's kind of interesting. We've stumbled around and kind of found over these years that there's kind of three different audiences, like where they choose to watch. You can kind of learn a lot about these people. And usually our YouTube numbers are the largest, and usually those people are people watching on a smart TV. So they're on their couch in the basement on a big TV watching. And so for them, whenever we try to engage with chat, it's not really convenient for them to chat because they're watching on a big TV. If they're watching on Facebook, it's right there. Maybe they're more likely to do that. So I want to hear just some more your thoughts on chat and how to do that well, because so again at Ridgepoint, this is just one example, but we've tried. We've kind of said, hey, if you're watching online today, let us know where you're from. We'd love to say hi. Or we've done the whole thing with, hey, if you're watching online, do this. And we've just kind of gotten crickets. Like we're not getting a lot of response online. So
Yeah.
if people they're really trying the chat, but it's just not working, does the medium play a part in it, or how can we do that more effectively?
Sure. Well, I think that chat is a really important aspect of hybrid worship. Um, but a couple things I think we have to keep in mind. First is that not everybody's going to chat. In the
Yep.
same way that not everybody in your church is going to sing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's some people that'll cross their arms and sit there and they're never going to open their mouth. Some people like to raise their hands and some people keep their hands to their side. So we
Right.
can't expect that everyone's going to participate in that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the second thing is just to remember that we have to teach them how to use this new technology. A lot of folks in the beginning of this thing didn't even know how to get on Zoom.
Right.
And so we had to teach them how to do that. And a lot of them now, participate in that way. So we may have to teach them how to chat too. We may have to teach them how to get there. Keep
Mm-hmm.
in mind that, like on YouTube, you have to be subscribed to the channel in order to chat. So even
Yeah.
if you want to chat, you can't until someone teaches you that, step by step process that we'd like for you
Mm-hmm.
to participate. Um, One of the things that I write about in the book is when it comes to chat is the idea of what I call the dual screen experience. So we
Okay.
might ask folks who are worshiping at home to also open a device. Hey,
Mm.
the best way for you to worship with us today is to open up the chat. So if you're watching on a smart TV today, I'm going to invite you to just open up on your cell phone our stream, and you can mute it so you don't hear us twice. But we
Hmm.
would love to connect with you in that way. And so there's an invitation to participate there as well. I think two other things that I would just encourage folks to think about. First is to just make sure that we have someone actually in the chat ready to receive people and
Yeah.
interact with them.
Hmm.
I have been to so many worship services where I will jump in the chat and say good morning, and nobody says anything to me. I can even see where they're talking to each other, and it's
Oh,
sort of
really?
like going to in-person church where you're a guest and no one actually talks to you.
Yep.
So just to make sure we actually have someone assigned, and I think people think, oh well, we don't have the technical people to do that. You
Mm.
don't have to be technical. Take the
Right.
same greeters that stand at the front door
Yep.
and just say, hey, instead of greeting people with a handshake today, I'm going to ask you to greet them with your thumbs on your phone at Hunt and Peck
Yep.
and just welcome them. Say good morning, respond when they make a comment, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then the other thing that I think might be helpful for some folks to consider is that no one wants to go first when it
Mm.
comes to those kind of public chat experiences. So you
Yep.
might ask a question like, "Hey, our reflection question today is what is joy or what brings you joy?"
Mm.
People are a little timid. Nobody wants to say to be the first one.
Sure.
So a couple things that I recommend. One is that you might consider asking some folks to prime the pump for you.
Uh-huh.
So I might even have a plant or two that I
Uh-huh.
might say, hey, this week I'm going to ask during worship, what brings you joy? Can I count on you to do that?
Yep.
Um, the second thing is that I think that when it goes out but is never really responded to, it
Hmm.
feels kind of pointless. So if nobody in the chat ever like, hey, great reflection or response, or I mean, there's really, I always say bonus points if you will actually verbalize it. So
Yep.
what if I save room in my sermon to say, we had a great response this morning in the chat. Matt today said, and I share that response, you are going to light up at home like, wow, the
Hmm.
pastor used my comment,
Yeah.
and the people in the room benefit from, oh, Matt's worshiping with us today, but he's
Yeah.
not here in the room.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just one other quick thing that happened
Sure.
that I had that experience. I had a church in Honolulu, Hawaii, asked me to secret worship for them online. I'm like, I'll do it, but I have to give the report in person. So you just fly
Right.
me out. And they're like, well, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks right now. And I'm like, I'm okay with that. I'll do that.
Sure.
Um, but I had to give my report on Zoom. But their time zone is 8 hours different than mine. So
Okay.
I'm worshiping at 4 o'clock. My time is 10 a.m. where they're at, and they said, "Does anyone have a prayer request?" This was early in the pandemic, probably like over the summer in 20. And my mother was a nursing home nurse
Mm.
who was just feeling daily stress
Mhm.
because as you may remember in the early days of the pandemic, a lot of nursing homes got hit with COVID and were
Yep.
losing residents and all that. So my mom was feeling super stressed about it. She ended up retiring early because
Mm.
she couldn't take the stress of it. She had to work in the COVID wing
Wow.
at her nursing home and all that. So anyway, that morning I put in the chat, please pray for my mom who is a nursing home nurse. And
Hmm.
within 10 seconds of me putting that in the chat and hitting the enter button, the pastor then said, "We want to lift up Jason's
Mm.
mother, who is a nurse." And I'm sitting in Ohio, they're in Honolulu, and in that moment, I'm like, "Wow!" Like
Yeah.
like I'm a part of that service, and
Yep.
they've included me in it, and it felt incredible. And that's where I started having these aha moments where if we will actually invite people to be participants in our worship, not just viewers of it, not just
Yep.
watchers of our worship, but
Hmm.
worshipers online, it can make a huge difference in the way that we experience God in a hybrid way.
Yeah, totally. I love that. And I'm glad you said that, because your time zone thing reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you. Because another point you make is there's actually three different kinds of people watching your services, right? I don't want to steal
Yes.
your thunder, but they might be watching live or they're in the room in person right now.
Yep.
They're watching live online right now, or they're watching online later, right? I think we
Yes.
forget that there's three different audiences. We might need to treat them a little bit differently. Can you talk about that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Absolutely. Because you have those three ways that people participate, you've got to think about language and how you're going to
Yeah.
include all of them.
Mm-hmm.
What happens by default is that all of our language favors the room. We
Sure.
don't think about the people worshiping live online, and we certainly don't think about the people watching online at a later time. So
Right.
those three groups that you mentioned. Um, so
Because
when you're
real quick,
giving
sorry to
inf-
interrupt you, but for a lot of churches, those online later numbers are significant, right? Because we hope there's a
yes,
lot of people watching live, but I know that at least at our church, Monday through Saturday, our videos get quite a bit of views, and we just forget to engage with those people, right? So sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to. This is
no,
important.
that's a great point to raise, and I think that it's actually probably as we move further into this, it's going to become more and more like that. I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard for us to wrap our brains around, but the whole idea of worship on demand
Yeah.
is possible now, and it wasn't.
Right.
I mean, it was possible before, but I don't think something dramatically shifted when we all were forced into this new reality that has been social distancing and all that stuff. And
Yep.
even as we're coming out of it, I think that something is permanently different.
Yep.
So our online, the way people engage with us online, I think has changed uh, for good. I've also heard stories about pastors telling me, leaders telling me that they've had people binge watch their services. They can see where it's like, I'm catching up on the series.
Yeah.
We do
Right.
that online. We do that on Netflix. We do that on Amazon Prime.
Yep.
It's kind of crazy to think that I might catch the third week in a series, and the message might speak to me, and I might say, "Hey,
Mhm.
I'm going to go back and watch number one and number two."
Yeah.
But if we're not mindful of the language we're using, I
Hmm.
think we potentially miss people.
Yep.
So here's what I mean by that.
Hmm.
Our language oftentimes is like, let's stand together for the reading of the scripture today, or let's
Hmm.
stand together as we sing. Now, do we really think people in their living rooms in that moment who are watching live are standing up? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's just a little tiny indicator to them that you're not thinking of them when you say something like that. So I encourage you to say, if you're worshiping here in the room, I'm going to invite you to stand at home. Find a
Mm.
posture that will allow you to fully participate in this
Yeah.
moment. And if you're
Mhm.
worshiping online, find that space where you can be a part of this moment as well. If you're
Yeah.
worshiping at a later time, I mean.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I was at a church service virtually. I was online, which I just used one of my pet peeve words that I say not to use. So I'm even learning the language. But I'll take a little side path just for a moment and say
Sure.
I am not a fan at all of calling worship online virtual worship.
Okay.
It's actual worship.
Hmm.
Virtual means simulated. I have a virtual
Uh,
reality headset that I got for Christmas in 20.
hmm.
My siblings and I all went together, bought my dad one as well. And about a week after getting it, he called me and said, "Hey, Jason, download this roller coaster. I want to ride it with you." And so
Yep.
he lives 30
Yep.
minutes from me. We
Yep.
got online, we rode this roller coaster together. I didn't feel any butterflies going up the hill. I didn't feel any wind in
Hmm.
my face or G forces. The only thing that was real about it was the connection I felt to my dad in
Yeah.
that moment. That was real, but everything else was simulated. So let's not call worship online virtual. It's
Yeah. I like
actual
that.
worship.
Yep.
It's not fake. It's not simulated. It's not a close approximation. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Hmm.
back to where I was headed there for a moment. Um, I was worshiping online last summer,
Okay.
and it was my daughter's birthday. My daughter has a July birthday, and so it was over the summer. And she wanted to have a couple of her friends spend the night for a sleepover on Saturday night, which meant Sunday it was going to be tough for
Hmm.
us to get the girls back to their families and have breakfast and all those kind of things and make it to in-person church. So
Sure.
we decided to worship online that morning. We typically worship in person, but that
Hmm.
day we were like, we're going to worship online. And so, without no malice, I don't even think it was carelessness or anything. We just have to develop new habits.
Hmm.
The associate pastor that day said, not looking at the camera at all, friends, if you'd like to pray with someone this morning, we would love to pray with you. We have care pastors here in the room that would love to pray with you. So just approach one of them and they would be happy to pray with you this morning. And I jokingly turned to my wife and said, well, honey, I'm going to change out my PJs, jump in the car, drive 25 minutes over to the church because I'd like to pray with someone this morning.
Right, right.
And you know what was ironic and a little frustrating to me was that they actually have online care pastors that
Hmm.
hang in the chat. They use the church online platform that will
Yep.
actually, they can pray with you. So the pastor didn't think to say, if you're here in the room, we have care pastors that would love to pray with you. If you're worshiping with us online, we have digital care pastors, and there's a prayer button you can hit, and you can go into a one-on-one space with them to pray with them. And then also, if you're worshiping with us at a later time, you can drop your prayer request in an email
Hmm.
and let us know that you'd like for us to pray with you or for you this week. And someone from our team will do just that. We'll either reach out to you and pray with you, or we will pray for you this week. So to remember that there are all these different ways that people are participating. I guess the last thing I would say is just
Sure.
be mindful of your temporal language.
Hmm.
Sometimes we really emphasize good morning, happy
Yep.
Sunday. Hope you're having a great Sunday morning.
Yep.
Uh, I
Isn't
don't
the
think
weather
we
great this morning? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a nice sunny day and
Yeah.
all that. Um, the thing is I don't think you lose a ton by saying that. They know when they're, let's say you're a first shift worker on and you work on Sundays.
Hmm.
You can't go to church on Sunday. So it may mean that you're worshiping Sunday evening, or it may mean that you're worshiping on Monday, which is your day off.
Hmm.
They know you're not filming it in real time.
Right.
I don't think you lose a lot by saying happy Sunday and good
Hmm.
morning, but I think you actually gained something by instead saying welcome to worship. Hope you're having a
Hmm.
great day today,
Hmm.
because today is whatever day that I'm worshiping online, and it's just a small little language tweak. I said that was the last one, but there's one more I'll
Okay.
share,
No,
and that
that's
is just
that's great. I'm loving it.
give context to what's happening in the moment too,
Right.
because um, like if yesterday were Sunday,
Hmm.
some of us might say, we just saw the tragic events that played out in Texas,
Right. Hmm.
and we have a heavy heart about what happened yet again.
Yeah.
And if you say it like that, I was not specific enough that if you're watching it a year later or 2 years later, you're going to be like, what happened in Texas today?
Right. Right.
You have to capture for posterity's sake.
Hmm.
Today in Texas, there was a school shooting
Hmm.
and 19 children and an adult lost their life. And so
Yep.
we remember those. And
Hmm.
of course, I mean, I can go to the video and see what date it's posted and then go to Google and search what happened on that day, but nobody's going to go through all of that.
Right.
So I've encouraged our churches to think about how do we create evergreen content,
Yep.
content where the gospel is alive at every moment, and simply just giving some words to here's what's happening in our world today as we are, because the people in the room, the
Hmm.
group number one, they don't need you to tell them what happened today or
Right.
yesterday.
Hmm.
The people at home worshiping in real time, they went through it just yesterday. They don't need you to tell them that, but somebody who's worshiping a month later, a
Hmm.
year later, 10 years later,
Yep.
need you to give context to that moment.
Yeah, that's so smart. I think all of us need to do a better job. A lot of these things are really simple, right? Or even just
Yeah. Oh yeah.
looking at the camera, acknowledging online people every once in a while. The whiteboard, all these things are, we can all do these and tomorrow or whatever Sunday is, whenever you're listening. But it's just
Yeah.
this kind of intentional shift of no, those people are as equally as important as the people in the room, and our impact could be maybe even greater to those who stumble across us online. So I think just all those tiny little mind shifts collectively can make a really big difference.
Well, the very first passage in the book is the Great Commission. I start with the
Yep.
Great Commission that we are
Yep.
called to take the gospel to people everywhere.
Yep.
It's a little, we got to figure out that whole baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We
Yeah.
can't do that as effectively online. But I think that we're living in a really exciting time in that we can take the gospel to people that we can't even physically get to.
Right.
People in remote areas who may have internet, may have slow internet, but
Hmm. Hmm.
um, I think maybe in our minds prior to this, the Great Commission was a physical thing that we
Uh-huh.
would, physically take the gospel to people. I was in a cohort call yesterday, and a pastor that I was working with shared this. He said was talking about the John Wesley quote that the world is my parish, and he
Mm.
said I've moved from the idea that the world is my parish to the World Wide Web is my parish,
Yeah,
which I was like, that's a brilliant insight.
it is.
So
Yeah,
very very cool.
that's good. Well, Jason, I feel like you and I could talk forever. Maybe, well, I love to do part two someday. Maybe we could continue this
Yeah,
conversation.
be
I want
happy to do
to,
that.
before we wrap up, I have one more thing I wanted to hear your thoughts on. I don't think this is in your book. I haven't quite finished yet, so I apologize if it is. But I've been thinking lately that like COVID obviously ushered in this new era of online church and people are wrestling with it. I feel like we're on this like the precipice of another evolution of online Christianity where we have most of us have some sort of online church service where we're just streaming or doing whatever we're doing. Some churches are also doing whether it's chat or maybe they're doing something like Discord or some kind of like online community where during the week you can log on and you can have a conversation or whatever. Those are both excellent. I think they're great. I think every church should do probably some sort of both of those things. But I sort of wonder if there's maybe a third thing out there that no one has really figured out yet. Some kind of online faith, something that I wonder if we'll start to see other people start to innovate and come up with other ideas where it's not just streaming something that's happening in a room and it's not just people chatting. But I feel like there's got to be something else, right? Like there's got to be something. Obviously, we're all competing with like Netflix and there's all this content out there. There's no shortage of content. But I feel like there's got to be something out there that hasn't happened yet that gives people another really authentic, really effective way to grow in their faith online.
Yeah.
Sense, do you see that happening? What do you have any kind of bold predictions? What else can churches start tinkering with now that we're in this season?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think you're right. I think there's something coming. I think maybe we're even starting to see just the seeds of it. Um, when the Oculus headset came out from Meta now,
Mm-hmm.
back when they were Facebook and released it, I think it changed the game a little bit for virtual reality because it was finally affordable and something that anybody could participate in.
Yep.
So I've seen churches start to do some things with virtual space, and I've got a friend named Michael Beck who's doing a virtual community. DJ Soto, I believe, is doing a lot of work around that. I know that Life Church has now opened an online campus in the metaverse, and so I wonder if, as technology, I think that we are just seeing the very beginning of this whole VR kind of world. So there's you can call that virtual because that's what the world is called, but I still think that you can have actual worship in that. I also think that we've got to start to think about asynchronous worship more than we are right now, and Bible study and all that sort of thing. In the book, I write about my friend Ann Bosarge, who leads a church called the Chapel Online,
Mm-hmm.
and she was gracious enough to share with me their sort of discipleship pathway, is what I would call it.
Yeah.
It's like a 6 or 8 step process that starts with just, hey, thanks for worshiping with us, to they join the Facebook group and we're glad you're here, to join our prayer group and we pray every week, and then join us every Monday at 1 o'clock where we will live go through scripture. And if you can't join us live, it's all there for you to participate in at a
Yeah.
later time. And so they monitor what's happening in the comments, and they're basically doing an asynchronous Bible study with folks, and then they invite them into uh, yeah, what is it called? It's the subscription service. Right Now Media,
Uh-huh.
they have a subscription to that, and they give them the code. It's like the Christian Netflix. There are 10,000 videos and devotionals and all those kind of things.
Yep.
And then, eventually they invite them to give online and all that. So really fully integrating them into the life of the church, even though it is a non-physical church. They have people worshiping from like 40 something countries, and there are hundreds now in membership. I mean, they actually have people that are full on members of the church.
Yeah.
So I think that something something to do with asynchronous,
Yeah.
participate when it's convenient for you to do so.
Hmm.
And it's not that, I don't, convenient is not the greatest word, because I don't think that we are to bring kind of a sacrifice of praise, and the idea that we are, there's some skin in the game.
Hmm.
But I also think that the reality of our world is, wouldn't you rather have somebody participate when they've set the time on their schedule, or they have that moment that is available,
Yep.
than to not be fully present, uh, and have their mind or whatever on other things,
Sure.
than to set aside the time that is dedicated to this moment. So, there's a lot we have to learn, and I also talk in the book about the idea that we've got to start to figure out what our rites and rituals are
Hmm.
for hybrid ministry. We know what they are in the building. We've had centuries, decades, to
Yep.
work it out. Now we've got to start figuring out what do those rites and rituals look like for online as well.
Yeah. Well, the good news is there's just so much potential, right? I feel like now that we know that these online people are out there, there's a real need for this. Most of us have at least some element of gear and experience now that we can start to tinker with other things. And I'm excited to see what comes in the years to come, because I think you're right that there's something else coming, and whatever it is, I'm excited to see whatever that looks like. So
Yeah. And going back to that whole idea of the wilderness, I think most of us have made our way through the vast majority of the wilderness. We now
yep.
know how to use the technology at some level. We have
Mhm.
the equipment, all of those things. It's only a few more steps into the promised land of that new reality, if we'll
Yeah.
just be courageous enough to continue to walk through it.
Yeah. Yep.
So,
Yeah, that's good language to use. Well, Jason, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to encourage everyone, check out Both And, his new book. It's just bursting up the charts on Amazon, and we would love to help that continue. So check out Jason's book, Both And. And Jason, if people are interested in learning more about you, or if they want to hire you to do one of your visits, how can we get in touch with you?
sure. I have a pretty major presence on Facebook. So if you go to facebook.com/Midnight Oil Productions, you can reach me there. I'm at Midnight Oil PROD, I believe, on Instagram. And if you want to just mail me directly, mail, MAIL, at midnightoilproductions.com, and I would be happy to chat with you that way.
Awesome. Well, Jason, you've
Well,
been so
thank you,
great.
Matt.
Yeah, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you so much for doing this. And again, I'm
No
excited to
problem.
continue finishing your book. And thank you for all your great ministry that you're doing. It's very important. So thank you.
As they say at Chick-fil-A, it's my pleasure.
We've got to end there. Can't beat Chick-fil-A. Thanks, Jason.